Hello, and welcome back to part 2 of our look at the Conter Conference, which took place recently. If you haven't seen part 1, we'll link to it below. It was an excellent discussion that we had with Liam McLaughlin, who was the first speaker actually at the conference.
And it was Liam, in his speech at the conference, who described the Yes movement as a disruptive force, which we rather liked.
We liked that.
Hence, we're picking that up as a title for these two podcasts. A disruptive force, part 1, and now part 2.
So what we're going to do is pick up some clips from the speakers, or some of the speakers from the conference. And we're actually going to start with Laura Webster, who is the editor of The National. Now, all of these are clips from longer speeches, but obviously we don't have time to replay the entire conference in this recording. But Laura has a very interesting point, which had not occurred to me, actually. So let's hear what she's got to say.
I would argue that the pandemic didn't only provide a temporary boost to an already fairly popular First Minister's favourability ratings. The events that led to that record polling had another impact. In informing the public about devolution, it resulted in people no longer buying into SNP narratives about being unable to fight the Westminster establishment. It showed people that the party had real power, and in doing so, changed the perceptions among the public for good. The pandemic undoubtedly opened people's eyes to the workings of devolution more than any previous crisis or news event ever had. The electorate had to hear 2 lots of public health messaging all the time and interpret which information was meant for them. So working as a reporter and an editor before, during and after COVID, I can tell you that nothing made people go onto news websites like the pandemic did. And newsrooms across Scotland that may have otherwise completely ignored decisions made by the Scottish Government were suddenly like, oh, okay, people want to hear about this. And it would become a quite lucrative opportunity for them. So every single Scottish Government update brought in huge spikes in traffic. And in doing this, this created an environment where people's understandings of government changed. One senior Scottish Government advisor I spoke to about this recently said that when you say the government to Scottish people now, they typically think of Holyrood. You might think that they were happy about this, but they did not think that this was a good thing. They would much rather people think government Westminster. So what at first was a welcome platform to the SNP inevitably became a heightened media environment in which all decisions made in Scotland came with a heightened scrutiny, and with that, a more critical public. Post-2021, the electorate understood the separation of powers better than ever. The SNP were no longer scrappy upstarts, they were firmly the establishment. We are now in an environment where the Scottish Government's budgets are followed more closely, and more austerity is certainly coming. Of course, this is linked to Westminster, but many think tanks and campaigners are gaining traction for pointing out that ideas like a land tax or council tax reform could make a serious difference. The electorate does not understand why Holyrood ministers are not taking these ideas and running with them. And this is only reinforcing the idea of the SNP as faraway government figures. It is without a doubt a very different time to 2014.
And there's so many interesting things in there, isn't there?
I just thought that was such a good little bit of analysis there. And I mean, even just picking it up from, you know, the difference that started to make in the COVID, because I mean, I remember that, you know, you'd get Nicola on every day, and then maybe, I don't know, a few times a week, if that, Boris Johnson would be on, and the comparison between him and her was just staggering. I mean, I'm sure I'm not the only person who has, you know, friends and family down in England. They tuned in to BBC Scotland to listen to Scottish updates because it was just obviously more reliable, more fact-based, evidence-based than what you'd get out of Boris Johnson's mouth. So that doesn't kind of surprise me. But I also did start to notice that after Nicola Sturgeon had done the update, and then some of her scientific advisors had said a few things, then you'd get questions from the press. And I definitely remember the occasions when someone would come on and you just knew it was going to be, if it was about COVID at all, it was going to be, they were going to be having a dig at the Scottish Government. And that started to happen, I think, once we got a bit into it and people did realise just what high quality, you know, information was being provided. I mean, not all of it from Nicola herself, but her mannerism, I think, helped a lot for, you know, for people to pick up on that. So I thought that was a really good bit of analysis.
Yeah, I mean, the other one that struck me just when she was saying it was that, and coming from apparently a senior SNP official, we don't know who, but I have heard the point that people, when they say the government, people in Scotland mean Holyrood. And I've always thought, well, surely that's a positive thing, because that means people are associating Holyrood with the important things to do with the day-to-day, aspects of our life. And Westminster is much more of a distant irrelevance, actually, in a lot of ways. But the fact that the SNP, or a person in the SNP, should think that that was a bad thing, and they'd rather people thought of the government as Westminster, because then they could blame them for everything, just seems an extremely bizarre kind of attitude.
Oh, that's interesting. I picked that up completely the other way around. I thought she was meaning that was a comment from a unionist, from a Westminster spokesperson. Oh, okay, right.
She said it was an SNP one. And, the fact that the SNP has or had become the establishment, you can kind of see where some of the current woes almost stem from that, because you've now got people who are looking at the establishment and going, well, we don't like that, we don't like that, we don't like that. They are no longer the movement that was fighting for independence, or the opposition, or... Yeah,
not that it's fair that they should be that. I mean, if you are in government, you're in government, and there are responsibilities that come with that.
So that was the first clip that got us going, didn't it?
That certainly got us going. Yeah.
Let's go back to Jim Sillars, who was involved from the very, very early days, and he did quite a long speech. This is obviously only a section of it, but we thought he spoke a lot of sense here.
Although we've had catastrophic SNP performance, we're still at 45% in the opinion polls, and sometimes touching 50. Now, the reason I am optimistic is that the terms of debate between 2014 and now have changed dramatically. Remember the case. 2014, you're too poor. You've got to stay under the umbrella of the great, big, powerful United Kingdom economy. That is no longer a viable argument in the unionist side. The United Kingdom is a poor country pretending to be rich. Go and look at its budget deficit. Go and look at its national debt rising exponentially. It's food bank Britain, in which nothing works. We've got to be able to turn the tables on the unionists. And bear this in mind. If we're going to go from 45 to 55, we've got to win unionist votes. No point going up to somebody and saying, look, you traitorous bastard, and then saying, by the way, we would like to talk to you about independence. Our approach to the unionist section of our community, that's our target, has got to be what you believed in 2014 no longer applies. Look at it. We've got to explain that the British state is a misnomer. It's always been the English state with Scottish and Welsh appendages. It couldn't be any different. You know, even with the best will in the world, it couldn't be any different. England was always going to be the major bloc that dictated policy. And we've got to say to them, look at the state of that state. Look at the pillars of that state. Parliament, no longer held in high regard. In fact, they've got to pass so many internal laws because people don't trust the MPs to act as honourable gentlemen and ladies. The justice system. They can't even keep folk who should be in prison. The justice system is not working. The military, the smallest army since Waterloo, couldn't defend Cornwall. Do you realise that if NATO went to war with Russia tomorrow, The British contribution would be a brigade, not even a division. The Royal Navy, the Daily Mail last week, Daily Mail, so it's true, published the state of the Royal Navy. Ships are not at sea. We've got 2 aircraft carriers which cannot operate as battle groups because there's not enough frigates and destroyers to make up their screen that require for an aircraft carrier. Doesn't matter where you look, that pillar of the state, the military, is crumbling. The police, nobody agrees with them any longer as somebody you can trust. And then there's the Church of England, something that Scottish nationalists never look at. But have a look at the deterioration of one of that great pillars of the English state, the Church of England. It's actually in crises. And then you've got the other institutions, the NHS, Disney work, the BBC. People are no longer deferential because they can't trust it. So all the pillars of that state are crumbling. And the result is, we've got to say to our unionist comrades, if you want to remain poor, if you want to remain that you're not going to be able to meet your aspirations, stay in partnership with that declining state. It suffered 2 major shocks. The 2008 banking crisis was a major shock. The mishandling of the pandemic, that was trashing the economy, is the second major shock. And the policy since 1945 no longer applies. From 1945 onwards, it was managed decline, post-imperial decline. Now it's precipitate decline that we're actually seeing. That's the case we've got to get across to our people. And that's why I'm optimistic. The whole term of the argument has shifted in our favour.
Excellent.
It was stirring stuff. I mean,
It was.
that point about the Church of England, I have no idea what he's referring to there. I suppose that's the point he was making, wasn't it?
I mean, when he mentioned the aircraft carriers, I thought that was going to be a comment about how they're aircraft carriers without any aircraft that can land in them and be used from them. But I hadn't kind of remembered that if you're a big aircraft carrier, you need a whole, you need to be defended, and you need smaller but still large Navy ships to do that. So that was a bit of an eye opener, and just the whole thing, isn't it? I mean, I was sitting listening to that. There's a very old friend of mine. We went to university together, and I know she voted no in the referendum, and we occasionally kind of touch on it, but not so much really. It's a little bit difficult. But actually, I thought, oh, that's given me a way of having a conversation that isn't sort of saying, if that was the basis on which you voted no, do you think that really stacks up now? And then going into it a bit, I thought that was really useful. And I was struck by, at one point when he said, our unionist comrades. Because, to be frank, there's a lot of rude comments, is putting it mildly, from yes supporters on social media when they're referring to, well, it might be the Scottish Tories or whatever, and you think, not that I completely disagree with what's being said, but in the back of my mind I was thinking, look, these are the people that we do have to persuade, and that's really what he's saying, isn't it? That's the task.
There was an interesting question when he was speaking, that we've heard a lot about positive campaigning and negative campaigning. And the way he was describing that, it seemed to be quite clearly, look, get in about them and say, here's all the things that's wrong with the union. Here's all the things that are worse than they were in 2014. It's a fine line to do that and not be perceived as anti-English, because actually if what we're criticising is the state of the UK and the union, it's as bad for people in England as it is for people here. So I think that's a fine line to walk. But I do think there are people, I hear people still saying positive campaigning will win out over negative campaigning. Now, it didn't in the Brexit referendum. That was all about Project Fear, and it didn't in the 2014 referendum. That was about Project Fear. So I don't know why a positive campaign on its own, is likely to win out again. But I think if we're going to match a sort of, here's the positives and the opportunities and the possibilities of independence, there's a great case you can make for that. But I think it's really valid to also spend some time talking about, and here's what you're trying to get away from. Here's the bad stuff that you're keeping in place if you stay in the union.
Yeah, I suppose that's true. I mean, if I just carry on thinking about my old friend, university friend, I mean, what Jim Sillars said just now, that could give me that kind of approach, especially about, sheltering. We need to shelter under the broad, powerful umbrella of the United Kingdom. That gives me a way of starting a conversation, because I could sort of say, is that what you thought? And do you still think that? So, and it could make some of the points that he's just made, but I don't think that's enough. I mean, and I don't think Jim Sillars would say that that's enough. You've still got to be able to make the positive argument for what we could do if we were in charge of our own finances. So that's the other part. That's the flip side of the coin, isn't it? But yeah. I thought what he does is he just gives a very, straightforward, common sense way of opening the door on that.
Well, you can let us know how you get on with that conversation.
Yes. Well,
that could be episode 3.
I might even. She wouldn't come on. I could ask her on, but I don't think she'd come on.
Well, that would be cool.
Who's next?
Now, who's next? Gerry Hassan, another great thinker of our age.
The limits of nationalism is something we see the world over. The story of our nationalism is different from all other nationalisms. Broadly true, but it's a nationalism. And I always draw this point that even speaking to, dozens of SNP branches, they nearly always get from the Irish writer Fintan O'Toole. And Fintan wrote in 2014, nationalism is like a rocket fuel. It gets you powerfully out into space, but it burns up quickly. Its rocket fuel burns up quickly, and it leaves you with no guidance system. And that's true of Ireland, it's true of Scotland, it's true of everywhere. Why would we be exceptional on that? And I think the future of our politics this is where I have some disagreement with some of the panel, but it is about post-social democracy, because why is our centrist social democracy like, the end game? And I think it's also post-nationalist, because the limits of nationalism. And I think we have to talk about the big ideas and not falling for a miserablism of the left or the right, while accepting the huge challenges we face. Not buying the myths of Scotland. Scotland's not this, celebrated collective democracy. We've barely begun that story. And I also think, again, avoiding the scattergun term, again, maybe controversial, neoliberalism all the time. Not everything we dislike is neoliberalism. Some things are, some things aren't. So we need to address the big issues. That involves heavy lifting, 10 years after, on talking about the economy, talking about democracy, talking about interdependence, talking about a futures literacy. There's a future gap in independence. The SNP just said, trust us, we'll create the future for you after independence. The future's always here, living, breathing, to be nurtured. And the SNP are not interested in that version of independence. They are, in a sense, which will be in one of the next sessions, I think, a court party. A court party is how Scottish politics has been done, time memorial, power, patronage, control. It's what the Labour Party were. It's what actually pre-1707, when we had a court, pre-1603 rather, how politics was done. And I just want to end with this quote and see if someone can guess who it is. This is 1976, a key point in British politics. And this is strategy, and apologies for the gender language of this, strategy matters, policies matter, but behind them all stands the vision. Scorn not the vision, scorn not the idea. Mao said that power grows from the barrel of a gun. A gun is certainly powerful, but who controls the man with the gun? A man with an idea. Anybody know who that was? Gordon Brown. Sorry? It was Keith Joseph talking about nascent Thatcherism. So my concluding thought to you is, know your allies and know your enemies.
Well, that was a very swift, energetic delivery. I'm not sure if I got left really quite knowing what he was saying.
Yeah,
Maybe was just a bit, too
There was-
not awake enough, but I didn't quite kind of get that. What did you take from that?
I liked the analogy about the rocket fuel and nationalism. And this business about, our nationalism is better than yours. We do that. We do that all the time, don't we? Ours is proper civic nationalism and not the kind of racist kind you get in other places. And I think there is some truth in
Well,
that.
I mean, that's fair enough. I mean, there's
Yeah.
truth in that. It's not as perfect as
Mm.
that, but there's a lot. There is overlap, but
Yeah.
that is on the whole truthful enough thing to say, isn't it?
And what I took out of what he said, though, was that, that we can all get fired up behind this idea of independence. We did in 2014. We need to do that again. But there has to be, once we've actually got that yes vote, which is sort of, where's the guidance system? Where do we go after that? So I think what he was saying is we need to have people saying, and here's what will happen, and here's what will happen, and here's what will happen. And that actually he's not seeing that coming out of the Scottish government just now.
Well, you wouldn't expect it to come from the Scottish government just now. Now, you might well expect it to come from the Scottish National Party, at any point since 2014. So is that what he was saying, that he reckons that he thinks that now, right now, because we're not at the point where we've got 55 or more, support for independence. Is what he was saying was, well, what would help that along would be to have some people or groups or even political parties saying, okay, this is what we do with a currency. This is what we do with a constitution. Was that the kind of thing he was meaning? I
think it probably was. And actually, interesting, those two examples, there are groups working on those things.
Yes,
as we
that's
speak.
why that was a very deliberate choice on my part just now, which is kind of like, well, so those things are happening, but maybe he's saying they've not got a big enough profile, or they're not being picked up, but that's a different thing,
The point I thought he might be making, or what I could take out of it, was that if we're expecting the Scottish government or the SNP to do that for us, then we're looking in the wrong place, and that it's the movement itself that's going to provide the rocket fuel that's going to get us to where we need to be. But then we all need to be, as a nation, looking at what kind of country do we want to be? What do we want our constitution to be? What currency, we know what currency we're going to use. What institutions do we need on top of that? I mean, I think he was saying it as a kind of criticism of the SNP, but I think actually, I'm not sure that that's fair, because what it's suggesting is there's a big gap there that we, as the movement with 45 to 50% support, could be doing something about, whereas the SNP with 30% support are perhaps not able to take that on. Are we expecting too much of them because the movement is more powerful than one party? For sure, the movement needs a political wing, but we've maybe expected them to be everything rather than just...
and I mean, what he also said, about the troop, the SNP do I don't know if they quite come out and say, leave it all to us, we'll get it all sorted, but there has been a bit of that, and that's obviously not going to work. But I put a couple of examples there, but there's also Commonweal. I mean, you and I know how immense amount of work that they've done, and we also know that they've been pretty well ignored by the SNP, if not even not exactly criticised, but put to one side, really, which is odd, really, isn't it?
The waste of a fantastic resource. And the other thing we've got, we saw what the Welsh did with their constitutional convention, their 3-year exercise, and we know the power of a citizens' assembly. We're not using them. We haven't done a citizens' assembly for a couple of years now. So maybe there's maybe it's more on that level.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I wasn't very taken with the rocket fuel kind of image, really. I mean, people who send rockets up are actually very, very good at calculating just how much rocket fuel they need to get to where they want to go, and then the fact that the rocket, or the bit that's left, will carry on going in that direction. If you put not enough rocket fuel, you don't get there. If you put too much, you go wheeking off into outer space and you're not in orbit, really. So yeah, it didn't quite work for me, that one. But anyway, I apart from that, I agreed with a hell of a lot of what you said there.
Okay, now the
next.
next one we've got. This is a very short clip from what was a longer speech. This is Kat Boyd, who is often, well, very outspoken.
One thing in particular I want to say very clearly is that I think that we have to, and I mean we, the radical left, we have to be honest about the consequences of independence. It might be brutal. We cannot go into or stand with fellows and say that independence is going to deliver a magical future if we're prepared to fight for it, because that's not the reality. Independence and independent Scotland will be prey to the same forces that we have seen sniffing around the ScotWind project. We have seen snapshots of what might happen. And I think that we have to take that very, very seriously. I think we have to be honest and say, yes, this might be economically very, very, very difficult for a vast number of people. But after that, we can build. We know that we can transform things. I think we have to be clear that the generation that votes for independence may have to make big sacrifices. We cannot say that, it'll be better than what we have, with Starmer in charge. It might be, it might not be, but we have to be honest that it might not be. We have to be honest with people and say that this might be hard. And I'll finish on this, because whilst the generation that votes for independence might have to suffer and make sacrifices, it's only so that the generation that comes after has the thing that we need now more than ever, that the last 10 years has proven very clearly, is that people in Scotland need a way to, without them being able to wriggle off the hook or slither out the question, we need a way to hold our political governing class to account without any blame being put on, it's their fault, it's their fault, it's their fault. And in an independent Scotland, we will have a way to hold our political class to account, but we have to be honest about the sacrifices it might take to get there. Thank you.
Now that started off doom and gloom.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. And I know, though, she did say it might be difficult. She didn't say it definitely will be, because we cannot say exactly what the future is going to bring. Any of us, we can't say.
It reminded me of that scene in Dr. Zhivago. So they've had the 1917, revolution, and in Moscow, and people are having to saw up their furniture in whoever's house they're in order to get the fire going and get a bit of warmth there. And it's also, I just thought that was a bit over the top. And to be honest, I don't like saying we have to be honest, of course, because no one's going to say, oh no, we shouldn't be honest. You say we're going to have to be honest, could be brutal, and then go on that way. I didn't think that much of that kind of contribution, to be honest. And I have heard her talk before, and I've been some years back, and I think it was in a CND march in Glasgow, and I was really impressed with her. Really, I just wasn't with that.
I think it's one of those things, isn't it? If you say, to be honest, so and so, that sets up the impression that everything else you say isn't honest.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why it's not a very
Yeah.
impressive way of putting your
Yeah.
argument. There's much better ways of putting it than to do that.
But what I did like about that, though, although I have heard people on the whether they're unionists or whether they were just not quite persuaded people saying, I want to hear about what it's going to be like. You know, are we in for 10 years of austerity? What is it? What is going to happen? Don't give us all this rainbows and poppies. Now, I don't think we do give them rainbows and poppies, but I have heard that argument put. And I think it's a fair point that, you know, we often hear people saying, well, this will be better with independence and this will be better with independence. And I'm sure it will. But the process of getting to that point might be difficult, and it is going to need a lot of work, and it's going to cost a lot of money and take a lot of resource to set up new institutions. And there will be things that are difficult. And I can imagine, you know, take pensions, for example. We were hearing quite a discussion about that at the Scottish Currency Group conference. And for most people, their pension, I think it was a state pension, it will be fine. But there are some groups, such as me, I think, who have a pension that comes from a British institution. It'll carry on getting paid in pounds. And eventually I'm going to, unless that is somehow taken over by the Scottish government, I'm going to be paying 2%, you know, to get it converted into Scottish pounds every time I want to spend it. Now, I accept that because I still think it's better that we're independent. But that's a reality that actually, is it not better just spelling out what these things are and dealing with them? And the point that she made there about big sacrifices are going to have to be made. When she said that, I thought, well, if you think back to what our ancestors did, you know, lining up to fight behind Wallace and dying in Falkirk, the Battle of Falkirk and all these things, any sacrifices we have to make are not going to be on the scale that they had to do. They were prepared to.
Exactly.
You know.
Exactly. And I mean, yeah, you can go that far back and they're good examples. And I mean, there was also plenty of people who put their lives on the line for, you know, more recently than that, actually, well, although not for a Scottish, you know, people do it, but generations, there's usually something for a generation that's kind of a crucial thing. Like for my dad's generation, it was the Second World War. You know, for our generation, it really should be climate change, and we're not making much of a fist of it, really. In Scotland, maybe, yeah, it'll be, you know, it'll be becoming independent, and yeah, we haven't done that job well enough either. I don't know. I mean, I just didn't. To be honest, I didn't really think very much of that contribution.
Okay, well, let's see if you like this one anyway.
Sorry, un point.
Well, this now, say Independence Live had some technical issues, so they only had 8 minutes of this conversation, but it was quite an interesting 8 minutes. It is Jonathan Shafi and Alyn Smith, and they're talking about the EU, and Jonathan is very much from his perception, his ideology, and Alyn Smith is very much pragmatic. And actually, this was something when we were speaking to somebody at the Believe in Scotland rally, the Holyrood rally. She had actually been at this event, and this was the one talk that had really fired her up.
It's a shame we don't have it all, but let's listen to what we have.
I am not going to spend the next 10 years, where most people have agreed here there's not going to be a referendum, going around the place, arguing for a fantasy yes vote, which we don't have access to, on the basis of complete acquiescence to the institutions, which in my opinion are a problem. The European Union is not democratic, and it's going through its own crisis. Look what's happening just now. They're setting up hard borders within Europe on the basis of migration. Look at the question of the European Commission, unelected. And also look, and I'll finish on this, at the question of where we are today in the world when it comes to foreign affairs. You see, I was a great fan of Hamza Yousaf's position on Gaza. I think that he stood up and he made a principled stand, but he did it in a way that brought people with him, in my opinion. To me, this is the question of the era. When John Swinney took over, that question dropped like a rocket. Yes, they've got the formal position, it dropped. And Angus Robertson has a private meeting with an Israeli diplomat, apparently to transmit the need for a ceasefire. Well, we can't even see the minutes of that meeting, which tells you probably quite a lot. And the issue here is, it's just another example. Constant acquiescence to the prevailing order. My answer to this would be this. If that's what you want to do, Join Starmer's Labour Party. If that's what you want to do, a mainstream party that doesn't rock the boat, that doesn't deliver domestically, that doesn't take on the central confrontations involved in setting up this so-called independent state, just join the Labour Party or some other similar organisation, the Lib Dems. That's how serious the situation is, I think, for the independence movement. And unless we get real about these big issues, we're going to continue to prolong the post-2014 era, which in my opinion has come to a firm end, requiring new thinking, new strategies, and as I say, a real introspection about what independence actually means. Unless it's meaningful, it's pointless.
The truth emerges from an honest disagreement amongst friends. And maybe some in the Yes movement need to remember that we are actually all on the same side in this. And my priority is only to get as many people over the line to Yes in Scotland as I can. And the point about the pragmatism of the SNP's position in a lot of defence, foreign affairs postures, I take the point, I do. But to say things like the EU is not democratic just isn't serious.
Oh, come on.
It's just not serious. It's just not serious.
Have you read nothing about the EU?
I've read a few things about the EU, pal, aye. To say that it's not democratic is out of step with the people of Scotland, 71% of whom want to join the EU. Now, if you want to be out of step with the people of Scotland, by all means, have whatever position you like. But we need to deal with the things that exist in the world. Independence is not about ourselves alone and pretending that Scotland's borders are somehow immutable, that nothing's ever going to cross them. Humankind is the most globalised and interconnected than it ever has been ever, and that's increasing, not decreasing. Now, I take the point about how the rules-based international order is under threat. I take the point that the EU is not perfect. I'll happily wax lyrical on the things I would do to reform the EU. But pick a side, guys. By telling the people of Scotland that the whole global system's broken and we should somehow withdraw from it, which is all I'm hearing today, is not going to get anybody over the line to actually get stuck in and be an independent voice within those frameworks for change. Now, we've heard a lot about NATO. Most NATO states are non-nuclear. A number of NATO states are very progressively pushing against nuclear weapons. Now, I take the point that nuclear stuff is integral to NATO's position. But the EU is evolving really fast on defence and PESCO type issues already as well. So my standpoint is always that I want to see Scotland join things, not pretend they don't apply to us. And that's how I think we're going to get the people of Scotland, which is, remember, the people we need to persuade, over the line for yes. And then it's up to the people of Scotland to decide what they want to do with that. And if they want to withdraw from the EU in their wisdom, I'll be on the other side of that discussion, but if the people of Scotland in a proper referendum decide to leave, well, yeah, fine, I will go along with that. If the people of Scotland want to be a republic, well, I will go along with that as well. And this is a point for the British state. I will accept the criticism amongst friends that the SNP's proposition is a little bit not that much change in parts. Our position that the Crown, the Union of the Crown 1603, the Union of the Parliament 1707 are two distinct things. So an independent Scotland will keep the Crown under our proposition. Now that's pretty controversial within SNP circles, but I think again that gets the people of Scotland over the line. And if the people of Scotland then decide they want to be a republic, there's republics I admire like Ireland and Iceland, there's monarchies I admire like Norway and Sweden. And it's up to us as the people of Scotland to choose that. So if the SNP position's a bit fudgy and a bit milquetoast, I've heard the word a couple of times today, well, that's because we've designed it to try to appeal to as many people as we can. And I think that's smart politics. I think that's pragmatic. Yeah. And this is my point about the left falling out with each other before we get the power. Let's get the power and then use it. Yeah.
I always like listening to Alyn Smith. He's so good.
Yes, I mean, probably for those of you watching this are now not going to be surprised that I'm sitting here saying, yeah, I liked what I could go along with what Alyn was saying. That because it's a pragmatic approach. It's kind of how I tend to approach things, really. But there you go.
Yeah, but I think it just makes sense that there are some things that need to be decided after we're independent, because apart from anything else, it'll be a much better discussion and decision when we're not getting constantly interfered with by the country next door.
Well, yeah, and I think that's where the kind of the more idealist one that Jonathan Shafi was saying, maybe even Kat as well, not quite so sure about her, but you know, if you try and have that conversation, I'm not saying you shouldn't have those conversations. As many, let's have as many as possible in the run up to being independent. But it's really necessary to understand that the people who will be having those conversations are us. It's the yes movement that haven't. We don't get the unionists joining in. You know, you start having a conversation about how to set up a new constitution. Yeah, of course we can do that, but it won't include unionists, and that can only happen after everyone knows we've had a vote, we've gone for independence. Now, let's get everyone together and start talking about these things, whether it's being a republic, what we want in the constitution, you know, our armed forces, do we join NATO? And it includes everyone, and that's the only way. It's the only way to do it, really, surely.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. And so for our final clip, this is Dr. Tom Montgomery, who's a lecturer at the University of Stirling, and he is talking about some research that's been done. And I think this is very interesting because there is a lot of, you know, just in the selection of clips we've chosen, there have been people criticising various parts of the Yes movement, various parties, various individuals. This is actually a bit of research, and some of those things get backed up and some of them don't. So it's quite interesting to listen to this one. It's a little bit long, but I think it's worth.
It is, and it's particularly good that he puts in direct quotes from the people that they've contacted, some of whom are you know, senior kind of politicians or activists, and some of them are senior unionists as well. So it's worthwhile listening to it. I think it's good.
The reason why we're here is because little over a year ago, myself, Ewan and James Foley were discussing the fact that it's almost 10 years since the referendum, and we wondered if anyone was doing any research on it. We found that not really anyone was doing any research, empirical research, so we'd do it, and here we are. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about the findings of that research, because we were very fortunate. People were very open in terms of giving us their time, talking about their experiences of the referendum, but also its aftermath as well, and that's very important to the discussion we're about to undertake. The basis of our entire research really is a qualitative study, talking to senior figures across the SNP, former parliamentarians, current parliamentarians, people who are involved in various political parties and different movements and groups. And ultimately, what we find is that people do have this genuine sense of a political moment happening in 2014, okay? And so we try to theorise that a little bit, use theory, because we're academics and we love to do that, and apply that to our understanding of our findings. And so what we're trying to walk you through here is two connected ideas. First is politicisation, the other is depoliticisation. And I think it's important for understanding how we got from a position in 2014, this movement that changes the Scottish political landscape, to where the independence movement is just now. So what I'm going to try and do is explain some of the findings through that particular framework. First of all, I want to start by talking about society more broadly. When we spoke to our interviewees, we got a clear sense that everyone found it to be a very politicising moment. And what we mean by that is that the centre of political gravity shifted from the parliamentary chambers to the streets. And many people in here will probably have some knowledge and experience of that. No longer was politics taking place at First Minister's questions. It was taking place in community centres, in old churches, and across Scotland as well. And that's something that came across our interviews. Regardless of what particular position people were in terms of the party, in terms of the movement, they understood this was a political moment. And what was interesting about it is that people shared platforms together despite their political differences, which speaks a little to where we are just now. Now, what you do find as well as soon as the referendum is over, that 19th of September, the landscape's changed not just because of what's taken place, but also because some of the old institutions have been replaced by new institutions, if you like. The new institutions of Scotland's civic sphere. You have platforms like Bella Caledonia, Commonweal, Wings Over Scotland, all these different types of platforms come forward, and they start to become very important in terms of some of the discourse as well. What we also find, though, is when we speak to those who are involved in the Yes campaign itself, they start to give a sort of different picture of events. So you have, for example, an official who we spoke to, a senior official who was involved in the Yes campaign at the time, explaining the role of the SNP, and explaining it in a way where they say, and I'll quote directly here, I think possibly at the earlier stages, I think there was this view that, Yes Scotland has to speak with one voice. But I think as we went through the campaign, it became evident that not only was that not the case, but there was actual positive advantages to it, to not speaking with one voice. Now that sense is that there's an opening, that Yes Scotland give this sort of platform to different movements and groups. But another official that we spoke to gave a contrasting insight, and that was that Yes Scotland was important, that's a direct quote, I think for the SNP, to ensure that there was a diversity of voices and perspectives, but that none of them became too critical of the SNP. Okay? So you have this sense that Yes Scotland has this, there is a conflicting view of its history. Another thing that came through as well from some of our interviews was some criticism of Yes Scotland as an official campaign itself. So one parliamentarian told us, for example, I'll quote again, Yes Scotland weren't really delivering. I do remember that. They seemed to be spending all their time trying to acquire offices, then bragging about how they got offices that they could claim were on Hope Street. So there was this sense that Yes Scotland has this very different history, okay, some conflicting views about it and its role. And there is also a sense that there's a conflicting insight, if you like, into what happens in the SNP. Because immediately after the referendum, although there was a defeat in the 19th of September, for many people it didn't feel like a defeat. It didn't feel like a defeat because many people joined pro-independence parties. And the SNP in particular saw this huge increase in membership. And what we find is that people, once they engage with that particular form of politicisation, it's quite different to being involved in a street campaign. You're turning up to a branch meeting and the first item on the agenda is, what were the minutes of the last meeting? It's not the same as going along to a platform and someone's giving a speech and it's quite enthusing. And this came across in our interviews as well. We spoke to one parliamentarian who told us, and I quote again, you were going along to constituency meetings with 100 people at them, and they were in huge rooms, and you didn't know everybody the way that you used to know everybody, and the change was very dramatic. Now, that change happened to an organisation that already existed, the SNP, with its own organisational culture. And that certainly came across as well when we spoke to others involved in the party. So people who were still senior in the party told us that they were unsure what they were expected to do. They had this huge influx of members, and they didn't know always what to do with them. And the party wasn't exactly sure either. I'll give you a quote just now from another parliamentarian who told us, to be honest, and I'll quote again, I mean, the influx of members after the 2014 referendum, they joined a thing that existed. And it'd be a strange thing for us to do that thing where we say, welcome, come and tell us what we're doing wrong. We had an existing structure that was tried and tested, and all political parties organise themselves in this way. Now, the other thing that came across from some of our interviewees was that sense of many people joining, many dozens of people turning up to branch meetings that never happened before, but this being seen as a threat to the control and the management of the party. Okay? So one interviewee told us the leadership was completely at sea, and that's when something happens. They're frightened of this army of volunteers and supporters. They don't know how to cope with it because it's a threat, because it's in danger of shifting the focus of the party away from an electoral machine. And so it's partly fear. It's partly fear of a loss of control. And that's when we see this sort of idea of depoliticisation really play out. From this movement that's on the streets, moving towards political parties, becoming involved in all that sort of electoral dynamics. And that's very different to being involved in a movement. And the party itself is trying to cope with this, and its instinctive reaction is control, manage. rather than perhaps open. And many people would tell us that any organisation would have struggled with that sort of number joining, but certainly there were lessons to be learned from that experience. The SNPs in government, there is a sense that, it's having to simultaneously be a party that's a constituent part of a movement, that's on the streets campaigning with all these different groups and parties, while simultaneously having to steer policy, okay? And you get this insight that what happens after 2014 is a real centralisation of control, okay? So it's not simply a discussion of that shift back from the streets into the Parliament. It's not even a shift from a Parliament into government. There's a sense of a closer group involved in making decisions. And our interviewees talked about bureaucratisation, about centralisation of control, and some people who are very much of the opinion that the leadership was doing its best and were very much in favour of the way that, for example, Nicola Sturgeon was running the party, also told us that decisions were being made with a very close, tight group. So a senior figure in the party told us, and I'll quote again, "I have been and I am close to Nicola, and I think a lot of the characterisation that I read about her is actually wrong. She's a very warm, collegiate personality, but she relied on a relatively small group of advisors. That's just the way Nicola works, and she makes up her own mind in terms of what she wants to do." So there's this sense that centralisation of control, small group of decision makers, it's real, it happens. And the other thing that happens as well is that you get this sense from parliamentarians that they're constantly accused, they see it as being not engaged in the day job of government, okay? That's what opposition tells them, we're not involved in the day job of government. And many of them refuted this. The idea was from them that the day job was actually distracting them from being part of a movement. That they no longer were involved in that sort of everyday activism. They weren't involved so much in raising the profile of independence. They were managing a political brief if they were a minister. They were on committees. They were doing constituency meetings. So the everyday techno-managerial governance of running Scotland had become something of a distraction from their work as an activist. And for example, a senior figure in the party told us, I quote again, "The context of the Scottish Government that it wasn't focused on the day job is actually not correct. Ministers were very much engaged in what they were doing. It takes up a lot of bandwidth." Now, there's something else going on here as well, because the Scottish Government, run by the SNP, is a government. But the SNP is also in opposition at Westminster. It also acts as an opposition. And you see this sort of split between the group in Holyrood, which is very much focused on the steering of policy and government, and the group at Westminster. And there is a real disconnect about what's going on across these two different groups, about what they're doing, how they're organised, what their focus is, how they think independence can be achieved. So there's a real sense of a split, if you like, but not something that's particularly acrimonious. It just happens because one side is in government, one side is in opposition. I'll give you a quote from a senior SNP figure who told us, "That's the dichotomy that we have in the Westminster elections, where Stephen Flynn can do the cheeky chappy stuff and he does it very well, but we also need to remember that we're a serious party of government in Edinburgh, which is where I think our credibility stems from. We need to look and sound like a party of government, not a party of protest."
A lot in that, isn't there? It's very interesting.
Yeah. What was your take from that?
Well, as he was speaking, I have heard that before from people who were around in 2014, that the first branch meeting after the vote, there was like 100 people turned up in Alloa and they had no idea what to do with them, and I know that people, I understand that sense of being, activists wanting to carry on their activism and suddenly find themselves in that situation where it is, right, let's start with a minute. Who's going to second this? I think that is the difficulty that the SNP, that thing he's describing at the end, where they're in government in one place and they're in opposition in the other. And sometimes the two halves don't seem to have anything much to do each other. But isn't it interesting? That's also right now what Labour, the position they're in.
Yeah.
They're in government at Westminster and they're opposition at Holyrood. And
Yeah.
we can see there, looking at them, that the two sides don't necessarily match up. And you've got Sarwar offering to protect Scotland against his own party in Westminster. So it's a tricky one to manage.
Yeah,
But I thought, listening to that, I just thought some of the criticism of individuals was perhaps a bit, that we've heard earlier in the conference, was a bit unfair, because that's a very difficult situation to actually manage.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, the other thing, I mean, talking about the Labour Party being in a somewhat similar situation now, and they were also in that situation where their membership just burgeoned. I mean, round about, when Corbyn was standing for leader and having that kind of, big effect on people because he's such a good orator. They must have had to cope with that. I mean, their membership went up immensely around about times. The other thing just that occurred to me, just that when he was saying the bit at the end that you've referred to about down in Westminster, their opposition. The thing also is that a lot of the people who were elected as MPs in 2015 were themselves activists.
Mm-hmm.
They had whatever jobs they had. I mean, there might have been a QC in Edinburgh. They might have been a cancer surgeon down in Ayrshire. That they'd got involved, during the referendum campaign, and then end up, standing for Westminster and getting in. And that in themselves means there must have been a very different group of MPs and how they might have wanted to go about things down there compared to the people who were already in Holyrood, who were obviously activists at some point in their life. You would be if you're pro-independence, but who might have been in more run-of-the-mill kind of party politics for decades in some cases. So, I'm thinking, down south, I'm thinking about people like Joanna Cherry or Philippa Whitford. So that's all I just thought that was just good, food for thought. And yeah, as you say, I thought listening to Tom there that, yeah, those quotes and that research that they did, it refutes some of the more glib kind of criticisms that come out, but also some of the more thoughtful criticisms that come out. But it also backs up others. So really good contribution, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it shines a light on what is the essential difficulty that the SNP have, which is they are in government in Scotland. So there's so many drains on your energy that come along with that, because you have, that bit about the day job I thought was really interesting.
Yeah, and bandwidth, just bandwidth. Yeah. You have so much to do that you haven't got much extra unused bandwidth for other things, and that kind of rang a bell. Yeah,
and when you think of the of Humza Yousaf when he appointed a minister for independence, I thought, well, actually, that you can see why that would be a logical step to take. Nobody else has got time to do it. Let's make it his job. You can see the sort of logic behind that. The fact that it then didn't necessarily result in anything. You couldn't have one minister replicating an entire movement. It just isn't going to happen. So I don't know what the answer is. I think possibly we need to go back to getting the movement to step up and not expecting the SNP, particularly the government, to be all things to us. We need to get that movement more self-sufficient again, maybe.
Yeah. I mean, it would have been obvious as it being we and I have been talking here that I certainly wasn't agreeing with some of the things we said, but actually, what Liam said to us when we were talking to him, and he said it in his speech, was what's just important is you get people who do not agree with one another in the same room talking to each other. And there was more than one person said that during the day, and that's why I think that event was just really, really, really good one. And thanks to Conter for getting it together in the way that they did. They had some really good speakers there, and a lot of things to think about came from that.
Yeah, some energy. And thanks also to our friends over at Independence Live for giving us the material, because we've been able to share it with you. So I hope you found that as interesting as we did. There is some of the material is available on Independence Live if you want to see a bit more of the speeches than we've been able to cover. But it just shows independence, you know, any idea that independence is dead? No.
Definitely not. Great.
Right, thanks for watching, everybody.
Thanks
We'll
for
catch
watching.
you later.
Bye.
Bye.